Okay, so we're studying abnormal psychology. So you probably had some kind of psychology class before this one. And let me go to a bigger screen here. And it's going to be a great precursor for what we're talking about in abnormal psychology. So remember that the perspectives that we looked at in regular psychology, the way we look at things either through a psychodynamic perspective or a biological perspective or cognitive, whatever way we're looking at it, we will also look at things through abnormal psychology that way. So you can build on what you've learned in the past. So we're starting out with this first chapter, and I expect you to read the chapters first and then listen to my lecture. So if you haven't done that, stop the tape and go read the chapter and do the exercises that are online for that. Then come back and let's go over it. So that way it's kind of review for you. It's getting it back in your head for the second time. So the first thing that our book looks at is what actually defines it and the problem with defining it. So with abnormal psychology, it's very hard to say, how do we define what's abnormal? What's abnormal behavior? So we can say, yes, it's the scientific study of abnormal behavior, but then we still have to define what abnormal behavior is. So why do we do it? Well, we want to be able to not just explain, but we want to be able to treat. We want to be able to change abnormal behavior to healthy behavior. But again, then the question comes up, what is abnormal? What might be abnormal to you might not be abnormal to me. For example, there's little things that we can look at in our everyday lives when you think about people in your life and how they might kind of bother you. For example, I don't like going in houses of people that aren't very clean. I don't like when people come in my house and don't think of certain things that would mess up your house. Is it because they're abnormal? There's something wrong with them? No. And they may think that's a little abnormal of me to be so critical or so worried about things. There's a lot of people that go through life, they don't care anything for materialistic things. And they're free. They're free of those kind of hang-ups and concerns. So they may look at me like an abnormal type person. So as we go through the course, if you want to share some of your abnormalities with us, you can go ahead and send it to me. I will keep you anonymous and I will share those things with the class so that we can all see that we're in the same boat. And likewise, I will go ahead and share things that might be a little strange in my life. And one thing a professor said to me that I was talking to a colleague of mine when I was working in Saudi Arabia, she said, we're all a little weird in some way. And she's right. Everyone had like a little weirdity or abnormality, it seemed like. And we were with professors from all over the world. So it wasn't just Americans, it was Canadians, it was people from France, people from Russia. So we had this rich variety of professors around us, all with PhDs, every one of them. And yet there was something a little weird that we could point out about each one, and we could point out weird things about ourselves. So as you're going through this course, most students start to think they have the disorders because you will see some things that you can say, I do that. So I want you to be clear that unless you've been diagnosed by a professional, you cannot diagnose yourself. This course is not comprehensive of everything that's needed to tell if someone has a disorder or not. So don't think that there's something wrong with you after you've gone through this course. And please don't get paranoid feeling like that you have everything we talk about. So let's get more into the definition. Some of the words that have been used to describe psychosis or unhealthy mental behavior over the years, these words have come through. So I want you to look at this timeline and you can see the slang, crazy, nuts. Those are slang words. Those were never professional words to describe someone who has some kind of disturbance. It's hard for me to even say what it is. So I'm going to call it abnormal behavior. I'm going to call it psychological disturbance. Those are the kind of things I'm going to use through the course just so we can talk about it, just so we can pinpoint what we're talking about. But as you can see, we have a whole array of pathology that this has come through. So originally they're called unstable. We still use that word today. Madness, we don't use as much. You see that whole dark time period there where it was considered madness. And those were times when people were probably treated the worst that had some kind of disorder. And then you see insanity comes along, and we still use the word insane today. And we use it flippantly in our everyday language when we're talking about people. You're insane. You're crazy. You're nuts. We've said this to people. We've said it about other people. You might be sitting with your friend talking and saying, yeah, I'm not going to ask them because they're crazy. Or you look at something online, you say, wow, they're insane. So we just kind of throw these words around. We don't think of it as clinically they need to be hospitalized, they need treatment. So you can see as we come up towards this late 1500s, the word insanity comes in, distressed, disturbed. Then we get into unbalanced, which is actually a very good word to describe it. And that came along with Socrates and Hippocrates. So we'll talk about that as we get into the history a little deeper. Psychological, abnormal, psychological, psychiatric, maladjusted, and we still kind of refer to maladjustment, but we say dysfunctional instead, which also means maladjusted. Now we don't even call people mentally handicapped anymore. We call them dysfunctional, impaired, mentally impaired. You can see in the late 1800s it was considered a mental illness, and still today a lot of therapists will refer to it as an illness, a mental illness. But that infers that it's something that we can treat. So there's people that will argue it doesn't need to be treated. So we're going to get into some of those as well. But I want you to think about, as we go along, how would you define it? If you were a therapist, how would you rate this person? Yes, you were to the point of you are mentally disturbed to where you need treatment or you need to be hospitalized. Okay, so what is abnormality and how are we going to possibly define it? Well, there's a little bit of agreed upon ground that we can use to stand on. And one of those is using the 4 Ds. So this is where we find these common elements that most of the time we can point to. As I go through each one, I'm going to show you how they don't always pertain. So there's deviance, there's distress, dysfunction, and danger. The 4 Ds. Definitely those are going to be on your test. Definitely you need to understand the differences between these 4 things and what they mean as we're trying to define abnormal behavior. So if you look at the picture on the right, this is a woman for Burman tribe, and they paint their faces to ward off kidnapping and evil that would come to their tribe. This is normal. If we saw this woman with tattoos all over her face walk into a store here in the United States, this would be abnormal to us. This would be abnormal behavior. This would be deviant behavior. Whereas in other societies, it's completely normal. So is there ever really a thing such as abnormal behavior? Or is culture a definer? It defines it. So, for example, there's a lot of things that are deviant from behavior that might not necessarily be a psychological abnormality. For example, people who commit crimes, criminal behavior. When someone steals, does it mean they're psychologically abnormal? When someone rapes, does it mean they're psychologically abnormal? Because they're able to do things that the majority of people don't do, and it's unacceptable. Or is criminal behavior just criminal? We can also look at lying and flip-flopping, changing your statements, saying one thing and doing another, saying one thing and then saying another. You may know someone who has in your life that may have told you they believe something or they stand by something, and then later you see them being a hypocrite. And we use that word hypocrite a lot. You're a hypocrite. You're a liar. Are they just a liar or are they abnormal? Maybe there's some kind of explanation for their behavior. But again, a lot of it is defined by society. So let's look at some abnormal behavior. So the easiest thing for me to pick out, of course, I'm not going to show video of people we know or friends and family, but the easiest thing for me to pick out is politicians. Politicians quite often will say whatever they think their voters want to hear, whatever their party is saying at that current time. So I have some great examples here of politicians saying one thing and then later saying something different, or saying one thing and voting differently. So the behavior is different from what they say they believe. So let's look at some of these cases. They're very interesting. And you can find them left and right on YouTube, but I just picked out a couple, and we might not even watch the whole thing, but let's see. So I think the first one is on immigration,
now,
which is
you
a
can
huge,
watch your values too. Let's face it, cable TV is anti.
It's very big in the news right now, and I picked
policies we've been talking about as horrific.
So
that would surely come as news to the Hillary Clinton of just 15 years ago. In 2003, this is what Hillary Clinton said about the crisis on the border. Watch this.
I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants. Certainly, we've got to do more at our borders, and people have to stop employing illegal immigrants.
Huh. Nothing has changed since then, of course, except for her party's calculation that it could only win by importing a new class of voters, which they are trying their best to do. Mark Stein is an author and a columnist, and he joins us tonight. Mark, I don't know if you were prepared, really, to take a lecture on the Bible from Hillary Clinton and Barbara Boxer and the rest, but do you feel edified as a Christian and an American by the new theocrats on the left?
It's interesting. I think they're being rather selective in their sudden biblical fervor. It's very important to the left to maintain this particular public policy, which is what it was, as you said at the top of the show. That's what immigration is. It's a public policy. Yet whenever it's treated as such, Hillary and the rest of the left, and I regret now an entire phalanx of first ladies, has decided that we have to have the sentimentalization of public policy. Well, which is it? This is a country that is supposedly on orange alert. Over half of the illegal aliens present broke into a country on orange alert. That is to say, they've come here since 9/11. Americans shuffle like a bovine herd through security that demands to know the consistency of their pumpkin pie if they're flying home to Thanksgiving from New York to Cleveland, but the rest of the world is entitled to walk across the Rio Grande if they happen to have a little moppet in tow with them. You can't have it both ways. Right now, Americans are living on orange alert if they make a domestic flight, but their borders are open. You're the chumps of the planet for going along with it. And I may be the harshest person here speaking tonight, because I know as a legal immigrant how heartless and ruthless the legal immigration bureaucracy in this country can be to children, and the separation of families and all that. And these Democrats and Laura Bush never has a word to say about that.
What would happen if you showed up at the airport without a driver's license and said, look, I have a moral right to get on this plane, and you're a racist for not letting me on? Would that work?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, we're bifurcating into a society where the law-abiding are subject to ever more onerous constraints, while the avowedly lawless are somehow venerated and fetishized. I will say, as a legal
But you've lived this. If I could just pause and say, you actually are foreign-born, and you have, without getting too personal, but you have a family. I mean, how has the immigration system treated your family?
Well, I'll tell you, I was crossing at Derby Line, Vermont one time. I won't go into all the details, but the rather officious twerp at the border threatened to call ICE and have my daughter deported. And he said then she'd be in Canada and you'd be stuck here in America. And I said I wouldn't be much of a father if I did that, because I'll tell you, 10 minutes after you deport her, I'll be back in whatever country you deport her to. Because if the price of being in America is that I have to be separated from my children, then I pass. And I am surprised, frankly. We're told these are just hard-working people are being snatched from the bosoms of their mothers. It's awful. It's heartbreaking. Why don't we just say at the border, well, you can't come in, but if you do, your children will be taken from you. And why don't these people then say, oh, well, I don't want to be separated from my children. Can I go back across the Rio Grande to the southern shore? This is the difference in treatment between the lawful and the lawless.
I can promise you're the only person on television today who's asked that question, and I'm glad that you did. Mark Stein, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
So you see, that's very interesting that we have this kind of play going on, that we have one standard for, and we have politicians saying, well, we don't want any kind of law. We want everyone to be able to just come and walk in. Well, then it's the same thing. Well, why don't you just want us to be able to get on the plane without taking our shoes off or having any kind of ID? So I think that's a really good example. But to be fair, let's pull up a CNN clip. That was a Fox clip. Let's pull up a CNN.
Other hotel sites make booking hard. Booking with reservations.
The issue here, international trade. Donald Trump accused Hillary Clinton of flip-flopping on the Asian trade deal known as TPP. That's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Here's what he had to say tonight.
You called it the gold standard of trade deals. You said it's the finest deal you've ever seen.
No.
And then you heard what I said about it, and all of a sudden you were against it.
So his claim that she flip-flopped on TPP, in fact, that she supported TPP but only reversed after Donald Trump criticized the deal. Hillary Clinton's response was that she only supported it, she said, before she saw all the details, claiming she only hoped the deal was the gold standard. Have a listen.
The facts are, I did say I hoped it would be a good deal, but when it was negotiated, which I was not responsible for, I concluded it wasn't.
So let's look at the facts. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton did call the TPP the gold standard. In fact, here is her saying that at an event in Australia in 2012.
This TPP sets the gold standard in trade agreements to open, free, transparent, fair trade, the kind of environment that has the rule of law and a level playing field.
You heard it there, sets the gold standard. You'll notice no mention of the word hoping that it sets the gold standard. Our verdict on this, that Donald Trump's accusation is true, that Hillary Clinton did flip-flop on the TPP. Of course, for this and all other fact checks, make sure you go to cnn.com/realitycheck.
Okay, so let's look at this one.
Hey everybody, it's Jake Tapper from CNN State of the Union and factcheck.org, and today we're going to take a look at comments Hillary Clinton made just a few days ago in which she was confronted with comments she had made on the campaign trail, repeatedly telling the American people that she had never sent or received any classified material on her private email server.
After a long investigation, FBI Director James Comey said none of those things that you told the American public were true.
Chris, that's not what I heard Director Comey say, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to, in my view, clarify. Director Comey said that my answers were truthful and what I've said is consistent with what I have told the American people. That there were decisions discussed and made to classify retroactively certain of the emails.
Is that true? Did FBI Director James Comey testify that the repeated comments Hillary Clinton had made to the public about her private email server, quote, were truthful? No, that is not true. According to her campaign aides, what Hillary Clinton was referring to was Director Comey testifying, quote, we have no basis to conclude she lied to the FBI. But Clinton's comments to the FBI are different from what Chris Wallace was asking about, which were Clinton's comments to the American people. Congressman Trey Gowdy had asked Director Comey about a number of the comments Hillary Clinton had made to the American people, and here's how some of that went.
Secretary Clinton said there was nothing marked classified on her emails, either sent or received. Was that true?
That's not true. There were a small number of portion markings on, I think, 3 of the documents.
Secretary Clinton said, I did not email any classified material to anyone on my email. There is no classified material. Was that true?
There was classified material emailed.
Here's what we know about Hillary Clinton's emails. More than 2,000 of the 30,490 emails Clinton gave to the State Department in December 2014 did contain classified information. Now, most of it was classified retroactively, but 110 emails in 52 different email chains contained classified information that was classified at the time the emails were sent or received. 3 of the emails included classified markings, but they were not marked properly. Here's the bottom line. Although Comey did testify that many of the emails contained information that was classified only retroactively, he did say that some of the emails contained information that was classified at the time. Hillary Clinton had repeatedly told the public that none of the emails contained information that was classified in any way. A reminder to all you politicians out there, you are perfectly entitled to your own opinions, not to your own facts. I'm Jake Tapp.
So you can see from that, listening to somebody who's sitting there knowing that they sent at least 110 classified emails and knowing that the person who said they has already spoken. It can easily be checked in facts, but then they sit there and say, oh no, he didn't say that at all. As if we could somehow be brainwashed. So I find that very interesting. Is that somebody who's crazy? Because they think they can brainwash you by saying something didn't happen when it clearly did and there's proof of it? Or is it just a liar? It's just somebody who's under the spotlight and they're just going to lie. I mean, that could be the case too. Let me just shut this. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the last one. And as I said, I could find 1,000 more of these examples, but we'll just watch these few.
Democratic House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi recently gave a talk at the Progressive Caucus Strategy Center Summit when she said something that made me want to barf. She said, "My motivation is 1 in 5 children in America lives in poverty. I can't handle it. I just can't handle it. So every day I eat nails for breakfast, don a suit of armor to go out there and fight for the kids, because that is about everything. That is about the future." Now, it isn't her notion of being sickened by childhood poverty that makes me want to barf. It's Pelosi's massive hypocrisy. Because here she is, claiming to be a champion of the poor when she's worth millions of dollars, according to OpenSecrets.org. They list her net worth in 2016 as $43 million. In 2015, she was worth $100 million. Her net worth has fluctuated somewhere between $40 and $200 million for the past few years. She's got tens of millions of dollars in real estate. She's got millions in livestock. She's one of the richest members of Congress. This is the woman who says that she eats nails for breakfast to help kids in poverty. Sounds like it would just be easier for her to give some of those millions to fund a school or something. Pelosi's net worth begs the question, just how does a public servant become a millionaire many times over? Now, members of Congress make a little under $200,000 a year, and Pelosi's been in Congress since 1987. So let's just say she made $200,000 for 30 years straight, even though that's not the way the math works. Even so, that would mean she's just made $60 million over the course of 30 years. So how does that grow to $200 million? According to Roll Call's Wealth of Congress Index, a lot of it may have to do with her husband's owning stock in Apple, Comcast, Facebook, and Disney, among others. And I'm sure Pelosi has invested a lot of her own money into the market to turn a profit. So Pelosi makes millions off the stock market and off the American taxpayer, which is fine. Honestly, I don't care. If your goal is to be super rich and you get that for yourself, good for you. You want to profit off filthy corporations and Congress? Good for you. What I care about is the hypocrisy. What I care about is Pelosi giving speeches saying she eats nails for breakfast to help poor kids, when she herself is sitting on a pile of millions of dollars. That kind of grandstanding isn't fooling me, and seems more like a pathetic attempt to assuage her own guilt at being filthy rich.
Okay, so how interesting is that? So are these people crazy when they come to us and they say things like this and then live a certain way or have different facts behind them? I don't know. Maybe it's just that they're liars. So we can't really just say deviant behavior is grounds for being crazy. So the next category we have is distressful. Part of the definition is that the disorder or the psychosis or the mental illness has to cause some kind of stress. Now there's subjective stress, which is, remember, when something's subjective, it's not objective, so it's considering the self. Subjective stress is internal. So it's kind of things of like hearing voices. One of the psychological disorders we're going to go over during this semester is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is one of those disorders where part of the symptoms are hearing voices, having these hallucinations of voices, these vocal hallucinations. They do have visual hallucinations as well. Now this man, this is a real interesting story, and we're going to watch a video on him when we go through, I think, chapter 3. His name is John Nash, and he was very brilliant. And that's him in college. That's a picture of him in college. He had schizophrenia. Unfortunately, he had one of the most brilliant minds ever. And when he did his dissertation for his PhD, he invented something called game theory in mathematics. Now, this is not your typical video game. Gaming theory is very intricate and extensive. He knew that it was going to be it was going to be published a lot, and basically that's why he did it, almost like a joke, like he wasn't that serious about it. And it turned out to be the basis for so many different mathematical equations. He didn't even realize how brilliant his PhD was at the time. But this is a man that was extremely brilliant. And I don't want to give away all the details of his story. It's so interesting. But he was schizophrenic, and he heard voices, and they would tell him to do things, and he could not stop them. And he became paranoid. And he was diagnosed at the time when we had a category called paranoid schizophrenia. No longer do we have that separate category, but he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. And he saw so many different things when he looked around at things that were happening during the day in our world and on the news and just in his local town. And he saw possibilities. He called them possibilities, that could be the government. That could be somebody watching me. And so he gave in to that and believed it. And people termed him as crazy. And as he tried to insist that certain things meant other things, he was institutionalized a couple times. There was times when he took all his money that he'd been making off his writings, his discoveries, his job at Princeton, and he would take this money and he would just leave. He would leave his wife. He would go gallivanting around the world, and people saw his behavior as crazy. And 2 of his wives divorced him. He ended up with his 3rd wife they divorced once too, and she actually took him back years later, and ended up being with him until he died. But he went around and he was hospitalized several times. So what he learned to do is stop listening to the voices. They're still there. He still sees what he sees in everything in our world. He still sees all these possibilities of conspiracy and things that are possible that we don't see in our normal mind. And he's learned to ignore them and not live like them. He's learned to fake a normal mind so that people will be happy, so that he can live outside of the institution. It's very interesting. Now, was his inner voice distressful to him? Were the symptoms of his abnormal behavior distressful to him? No, they weren't. He didn't see them as distressful. Everyone else saw them as distressful. So it's interesting that this internal supposed stressor is not really always distressable to the individual. So it's hard to use that as a definition. Same thing with sociopaths, which we're going to talk about them in the future too. They experience very little stress or remorse for what they do. They almost have no feeling towards it. and that makes them particularly dangerous. Okay, the third one, dysfunction. So dysfunction, what I want you to remember with dysfunction is that it interrupts your normal life. So people are unable to hold a job. They can't do the things that they need to do for a job, or the things to fulfill their role in life. As a mother, they're not feeding their child. They're not getting out of bed and taking care of their kids. They're not, or father. But it's causing a dysfunction in their life. They're not able to do their normal role in life. So we know also in this area that culture plays a role in the definition of abnormality. So culture would also play a role in defining what dysfunction is in our society. So think about also that not always is interruption with our daily life an abnormality or a result of an abnormality. For example, you could have an abnormality that makes it to where it's hard for you to go to work. You're afraid, you're paranoid, you don't want to leave the house. That happened to John Nash a lot. He was paranoid. So you end up losing your job because you're not showing up, or you're coming in late. That's what this cartoon's about. It's like if they're coming in late. And yes, I stole it from Cartoon Stock, so the watermark's staying there. But what about when you just are lazy and you don't show up to work on time and you don't care and you figure, who cares if I arrive late repeatedly? Or what if you just lack the skills for that job? You lied on your resume and you got a job that you can't do and you repeatedly fail and you get fired, or you get caught stealing. Those are all reasons that you lost your job that have nothing to do with mental illness. It's just different reasons that your boss had to get rid of you. So not always is dysfunction a result of some kind of psychological disability. Okay, and then the last one is danger. So one of the best examples that I can think of is terrorism. When we call something terrorism, isn't necessarily because they're mentally disturbed, because a lot of the terrorist acts we would call abnormal, definitely deviant behavior. Almost all societies would call it that way. But are they not just criminals? Are they not just criminals? So where do we draw that line? And there's an argument that I used to hear a lot when I was working and living over in the Middle East. They resented how anything that had to do with an Arab was called terrorism, which is not considered mentally ill, and anything to do with a Westerner blowing up a town or going into a post office and shooting it up was considered mental illness. No one jumped on terrorism right away. Whereas they're trying to say, look, we are not terrorists. We have people that are mentally ill in our society, and it's mental illness, just like the white Westerner that goes into a post office and unloads with a machine gun and starts killing everybody, which we have lots of records of happening, or walking into a church. It happened not too long ago, within a few years, and just blowing everybody away. But that person's mentally ill, whereas if they're Arab, then they're terrorists. So where do we draw that line? Where do we say when something is mental illness and when is something terrorism? Now, I want to point out, and something you definitely need to know for your test, is that danger is the exception rather than the rule. Most people with true psychological disorders are not dangerous. The majority of them are not, even to themselves or others. Now, someone who has autism, there are dangers in life. Some may not have the capability to cook or do something or drive. So yes, there's some danger involved, but for the most part, the exception is danger, not the rule. So keep that in mind. That's definitely a good test question. So how do we define it? the elusive nature of abnormality just means we can't seem to put our finger on it. It keeps eluding me. It keeps getting away. I keep thinking this will define it, and then no, there's something to say that's not always part of the definition. So it gets very complicated at this point. So what do we say? Well, I want to say, and I think your book points it out too, that abnormality is a continuum. So I want you to think of a line, a continuum, where at one end you have 100% healthy mind, and the other end you have 100% abnormal mind, and then we all fall somewhere in between. But there's some point along that continuum where you cross over into psychosis, let's say. So we might have some crazy abnormal behaviors, some things that are deviant, some things that are dysfunctional, but there's some point where it crosses over and it's on the other side of that continuum. So we have to think of it that way. Is anyone 100% healthy? Do you think you're 100% healthy-minded? Have you ever had a moment where you asked yourself, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why did I blow up at my boyfriend or my girlfriend? Or why did I blow up at my child? Or why, so there's those times where we may lose control of our emotions or have a paranoid thought. Have you ever been paranoid? Have you ever thought somebody was following you? Have you ever thought you heard a noise outside and somebody was creeping around your house and nothing ever happened? So we're on that continuum somewhere. There's just a point where it crosses over into abnormality. Now, Dr. Saz, he believed that there is no such thing as mental illness. And that's another reason we don't use the term mental illness, because it implies like a patient-doctor thing where we can give you something to fix it, where it almost implies it's physical. Whereas we can argue that schizophrenia is a physiological component to it, definitely. It's not something we can talk you out of or explain or teach you. So there is that time where it is. But he tried to argue that, look, there's only a few. He's given it to you that, yeah, there's schizophrenia, yeah, there's a few. But really, because of that, we can never apply any definition of abnormality consistently. So let's listen to Dr. Saz. Your book talks about him, but let's hear it from his own mouth. It's just easier to understand from him.
When school authorities tell a mother that her son is sick and needs to be on drugs, how in the world is she to know that that is simply a lie? How is she to recognize that what experts now call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is simply not a disease? Now, such a mother is not an expert in the history of psychiatry. She does not know that psychiatrists have, for hundreds of years, used diagnostic terms, so-called diagnostic terms, to stigmatize and control people. I will only give you a few dramatic examples. When black slaves in the South ran away to freedom, it wasn't that they wanted to be free. They suffered from a disease called drapetomania. From drapetes, runaway slave, and mania. I'm not making this up. This was a legitimate diagnosis, just like attention deficit disorder is. Women, half the population of mankind, of course, if they were foolish enough to rebel against domination by men, well, then they had a serious disease called hysteria, which was due to their wandering womb. Now, none of those behaviors was ever a disease, and of course it's not a disease. But nor is attention deficit disorder a disease. No behavior or misbehavior is a disease or can be a disease. That's not what diseases are. So it doesn't matter how a child behaves. There is nothing to examine. If he is sick, then there must be some objective science to it, which can be diagnosed by physicians and objective tests. It's very obvious. As soon as you go to a doctor, they take a lot of blood and take x-rays. They don't want to hear how you behave. When I went to medical school 60 years ago, There were only a handful of mental diseases. I think there were no more than 6 or 7. Now there are more than 300. And new ones are, quotes, discovered every day. Labeling a child as mentally ill is stigmatization, not diagnosis. Giving a child a psychedelic drug is poisoning, not treatment. Diseases are malfunctions of the human body, of the heart, the liver, the kidney, the brain, and so forth. Typhoid fever is a disease. You all know that? You don't question that. Spring fever all you have to know is English. Spring fever is not a disease. The task we set ourselves to combat psychiatric coercion is important. I think it's important. You all think it's important. Not enough people think it's important. It's a noble task, a task in the pursuit of which we must, regardless of obstacles, persevere. Our conscience commands that we do no less.
Okay, so I find that very interesting. Dr. Saz really is telling us that people really aren't abnormal as much as they are just, they just have problems of living in the society that they're in. So you can see there that he was alluding to, or trying to say, that our societies kind of invent this concept of mental illness so that they can control people and change people. And he's implying that they actually lie to them. So think about this. If we diagnosed college students as having alcohol problems, what do you think society would say? Because really, we don't see them as having an alcohol problem. We see it as common in college for students to get sloppy drunk, maybe even have accidents or wreck or, endanger their lives. But somehow we don't term that as abnormality. So let's talk about what abnormality is not, okay? So abnormality is not caused or explained by something else. So for example, if you're a drug addict, then the symptoms you're having are because you're on drugs, not because you have a psychological problem or a mental problem or some kind of mental disease. It's caused by something, and we're able to pinpoint what it's caused by. It's something you're doing to yourself that's causing this. If you took the drugs away, your mind would go back to normal. The other thing that it is not eccentric behavior. So I believe in your book, and I don't have the book right. Oh yeah, I do have it right here. Let me look real quick. There's a page in your book that you can look to, and it describes a very eccentric man. And because of his choices and his eccentricism with how he wants to live, it is not in here. It turns out that people look at him as if he's crazy. Now he's not been put, oh, there it is. Yeah, it's on page 5 in your chapter. So go ahead and make sure to read that, because I may even use that as an example on the test. Maybe. But he's eccentric, yet he's not considered crazy. So this is where I give full disclosure. I'm giving you a little sample of what may be an eccentric behavior, or you might call an eccentric behavior in me. And I would hate to think that anyone would call me crazy. I feel pretty stable-minded. So here's my attempt to explain eccentricism. Some people are eccentric. So I'm going to share one of my own, hopefully you don't hold this against me, one of my own eccentric qualities or behaviors that I have. This car is 18 years old. No, 16 years old. It's a very old car. You see, it looks kind of good. It looks okay. It's got some problems with it. You'll see the seats are very worn. But at the same time, I've tried to take very good care of it. I'm eccentric when it comes to my vehicles. Here's a newer vehicle. I treat it the same way I'm treating this one. I like my vehicles to stay clean inside, and I like to preserve them as long as I can. I am not a person who buys a new car, obviously, every couple years like other people, turn it in and get something upgrade. Not me. This car is, like I said, 16 years old, and I drive it all the time, and I love it, and I don't need all the new features. Do you see the carpet? That's the original carpet. It's the original mat. It's spotless. Yes, the seats are worn. I couldn't help that. Getting in and out, in and out, in and out, the leather just started to crack. I will give you some advice on this. I clean my car every week with Armor All, and I think that contributed to it drying out. I really do. I thought I was protecting it, and I think I damaged it worse. But here's my eccentric behavior. When someone gets in my car, I don't allow them to wear shoes, and that's one of the ways that I kept this carpet so nicely. So I give a whole explanation of how to get in the car before I let anyone get in my car. They get a training session. So I demonstrate to them. I sit down in the chair, and then you take off your inside leg shoe first, and you put it upside down on the carpet right there. Then you take off your other shoe and you put it on top of that shoe like that. And then you can put both feet in the car. And you can see you can enjoy the feel of the carpet in the car. You can enjoy the feel of the carpet. My car is clean. I do drive with no shoes, and that way my pedals are clean. They're not dirty. The bottoms of my shoes are not touching them, so they don't dirty my feet. And another thing is, when you have shoes on and you stepped outside and you put your heel here and you're driving, you get dirt ground into your carpet here. Now you can see there's a lighter spot there in the carpet because that's where my heel always is, but at least it's not dirty. And you can see, because I've required that of my guests, this side is clean as well. So that's just one of the ways I take care of my car. People call it eccentric. People don't like it. Some people laugh at it. Some people refuse to go along with it. My ex-husband refused to go along with it. You see the car still here and he's not. Okay, so there's full disclosure of eccentric behavior. So abnormal behavior is not eccentricism. Some people, and this is where my colleague and I said, look, we're all a little weird in some ways, and this is one of the ways that I'm a little weird. So what is mental health? Well, let me just say, with mentally healthy people, we still experience emotions. We still experience grief, anger, fear. So all those things still come up and we still deal with them, but we can still function. That's the difference. So if somebody goes through a death, in other words, different cultures celebrate death in different ways. And you will go through a time of mourning in the 5 stages of grief. But eventually, at some point, the grief should subside. At some point, you should be able to get back to life. That is a mentally stable person. Another thing that defines a mentally stable person is that they can still be fulfilled in life, and they're realistic about their appraisal of their own skills. So some people think they can do things they can't do. And it's sad when people keep striving for something they're really not capable of. I can never be a car mechanic. I'm not strong enough. I'm just not strong enough. I've tried to do mechanical things, and I don't really like to either. So let's just say I'm not very passionate about it either. But there's some things we have to admit, you know what, you're just not that good at that. I like playing the piano. I enjoy it very much. I'm just not that good. I enjoy it. I play by myself, but I'm certainly not going to command other people to listen to me. On the other hand, I know some piano players that are magnificent. I beg them to play so I can just sit and listen. So a healthy-minded person has a realistic appraisal of their own ability. Okay, so let's go on to treatment. What is treatment? Well, definitely read this section. Read your whole book. I'm hoping you read it before you came here. But in your book, it tells you that clinicians actually decide once they decide that a person is suffering somehow from a psychological abnormality, then they want to do something to change that behavior. So they're trying to take abnormal behavior and change it more into normal behavior. That's what treatment is. So we have Jerome Frank in your book, and he gives us a criteria of what treatment is. This is definitely going to be a tough question. So to have therapy, or to have what constitutes treatment, is one, you have to have a patient. Now, it's a sufferer or a patient, but it's that person that's going through the abnormal situation, going through suffering from it. So it's some kind of sufferer who seeks relief, right, from a healer. So kind of, we'll call it a healer. To have effective treatment, you must also have the healer or a trained therapist, not just socially accepted, but qualified. They should have credentials. They should have degrees. They should have certification. So that's the second part that needs to be there. The third part is that you should have a series of contacts between the healer and the sufferer. That's treatment. That's therapy. Granted, when we go over the past, some more of the past, you're going to see that we don't have as lengthy of treatment as we used to have at one time. Like Freud required years, sometimes just years of psychotherapy and meeting with your therapist. So that's not always the case anymore. Now, besides that, besides the differences so that you see with clinicians, there are differences between clinicians on what it is they're doing or what the goal is that they're doing. Most of them will agree that people need therapy. However, there are two different types, or well, yeah, basically. So think about this. There's clinicians that seek to cure. So these are the people who see them as not just sufferers, but patients. So whenever we have a patient and a doctor, you have the doctor trying to find the cure for the illness. See, this is all borrowed from medical terms. So you've got clinicians that see psychological disturbances as a mental illness or as a disease. That again is something that we can medically treat. Then you've got clinicians that see the sufferer like a client. So it's someone that's having a problem with living, like Saz was talking about, but they come and they're seeking help to better understand or live in the world that they're in, or the culture they're in, or the role that they're in. And so the clinician sees themselves as a teacher rather than someone looking for a cure. Okay, so let's start delving into the past and how abnormality was looked at in the past. So first of all, let's just have a little background here. Abnormal behavior, mental illness, psychological abnormality has been present in all recorded time. Even if we didn't have it in writing, we had examples of it and evidence of it in paintings, artistic drawings. So it's not always been written about, but we have some kind of proof that it was always there. And then you can see that a lot of what we thought is rooted in the past. And I'm going to give you examples of how you can see it in our everyday language. You might not even realize it. But first, let's go over the statistics that are in your book. In any year in the United States, at least 30% of adults are mentally ill. 19% of children and adolescents actually display serious psychological disturbances, and they need treatment. So it's number one, it's been present all along, and number two, it's not just a problem of our modern world. So a lot of people think, well, there's so much more stress, there's so much more pulling on us today. No. A lot of that's why I'm saying here, many present day ideas and treatments, they have roots in the past. It's not just this effect of, oh, it's what we're going through now. It's so much harder in life anymore, but it's not. We've had these problems all along. And I don't know that we're getting better at how we look at people with abnormalities, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's look at ancient views. What did they see it as? Well, we are inferring, because when we look at some very old skulls, we see that in the skulls there was some type of hole drilling. So we're assuming that it was because people thought that they were demon possessed and they had some kind of psychological abnormality instead, maybe even schizophrenics who hear voices, see things that aren't there, so people think they're very tortured. Like with the witch hunts, the girls who said that they saw an aura of one of the ladies that they claimed to be a witch, and she was tormenting them with it. So we see that these holes in the skull, they saw them as something they drilled, and it's called trephination. They drilled to allow the evil spirits to escape. So, and we can see this in we still have shadows of this in our everyday language. So think about it. Have you ever said, what's gotten into you? Well, that's demon possession or possession of some type. Or we say something like, whatever possessed you to do that? Or whatever possessed you to say that? Whatever possessed you to flush that shoe down the toilet? I remember saying that to my kids when they were little as they flooded the entire house. Whatever possessed you. She was beside herself with anger. So we say all these things that lead all the way back to that thought that really abnormal behavior is some kind of work of possession or an evil spirit. So what was the solution? What was the treatment? Well, it was trephination. It was exorcism. Now what I put here is a clip. I could not really show you the clip I wanted to that really showed the exorcism and the process of conducting an exorcism, because there's a very famous movie called The Exorcist. You've probably all seen it. I didn't realize, I saw it when I was younger, and as I looked at these clips again, I didn't realize how nasty, how nasty this movie is. So just the wording and the language and the thoughts that were coming out in the scenes, I couldn't show you. But I'll show you one little clip that wasn't as bad as the others. So this is the priest, and this is towards the end when they've gone through all kinds of attempts of exorcism, and this is the senior priest that was there, and he's dead. He finds him dead. So in the end, she's still possessed, demon possessed. Yeah, there's no saving him. He still wants to save her, so he sacrifices himself.
You son of a bitch! Take me! Come into me! God damn you! Take me! Take me!
So that's basically the end of that one. So you can see exorcism was considered someone possessed, and that you needed to get that evil spirit out of them. So of course that was an overly exaggerated, not true movie, but I was trying to find some examples of exorcism and it was just too nasty. Sorry. Okay, so let's go to the next time period. 500 BC to 500 AD, the Greeks and the Romans. So as usual, the Greeks are ahead of their time, and they give us a lot of good explanation, I thought, in a way. They pull us away from the demon possession thing, and this is when Hippocrates comes along. So remember, Hippocrates was considered the father of modern medicine. So he believed that abnormalities had natural causes, and he alluded to the four humors. Now, the humors are just bodily fluids. So now he's getting a little closer to the truth, because what he's brought up, and this is why I say it's so far ahead of their time, is that the biological concept, that perspective that some things are biological imbalances. And that's what he was saying. There's an imbalance in these 4 bodily fluids or humors. And the 4 fluids that he cited were yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. Okay, so he said things like, if you were sleeping poorly, it's because, or you were depressed, it's because you have an excess of black bile. If you're easily angered, you have an excess of yellow bile. You suppress emotions if you have too much phlegm. Too excessive blood causes problems. So the problem with that they would use for treatment, you'll see in the list there, is bleeding or quiet life. Or so he started prescribing diet and using diet to balance things out. And all of these things are actually treatments that we can use today for healthy mental health. Watching your diet, exercising. Okay, so then we go to the Middle Ages, and this is a time when things again were focused on demon possession, and they had mass madness. So think about the witch hunts and those girls that were accusing all the ladies of being witches, and they were accusing people that lived very clean lives and really had nothing to hide at all of being witches. But these girls were so good at it. And if you think about the time period that they lived in, they were in a very boring Puritan time period where they really didn't have a lot of fun. So it was easy for them to just start making this stuff up to get attention. And as they saw one do it and get attention and everything that she was getting to enjoy, it started spreading. And all of a sudden, all the girls were doing it. So we know that a lot of those women, of course, were not possessed by witches or were witches. But this was the kind of thing that was going on during that time. And there was mass madness. So there were massive groups of people that were having delusions, hallucinations, and this mass hysteria or mass abnormal behavior was happening during a time where everything was very strict. People thought or started looking at demonology. So what comes back? Well, kind of the same thing that we looked at earlier, exorcism. So we've got exorcism. They were tortured because they weren't torturing the person in their mind. They were torturing the demon that was possessing them. And then they hospitalized them. Think about this when you think about mass hysteria, how things spread in the regions that they were in. Think about now how it's possible for a mass hysteria or a mass trans of madness. Think about the sources that we have now, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the kind of things, and the internet, even just text messages, that how might those things really facilitate mass madness? You know, we see what's happened with the elections and how things go when we have this kind of technology and this type of communication. You know, there was a time where all there was TV and literally calling someone on a telephone. Now it's you have a mobile phone with everything. Your whole computer is right at your fingertips. Everything's at your fingertips. It's a search engine. It's all of those things. It's not just being able to contact people in your list on your phone at any time, anywhere. Everybody's accessible. Communication has totally changed. So we could easily start a mass. Think about just the ice bucket challenge. If you guys remember that, how that spread across the country, then across the world. It started being international. So it's funny how things can spread quickly and catch on, and everybody starts doing it. So it's just an interesting thought. Nothing you'll be quizzed on. The Renaissance and the rise of asylums. So what happens? Now we're up to 1400, 1700 AD, and Johannes Weyers, and in your book it's Weyer, but you can see by that actual excerpt from his writings, that's not how his name is spelled. So your book puts it a little differently. Johann instead of Johannes, Weyers instead of Weyer. But anyway, doesn't matter. I'm not going to test you on how you pronounce his name. The thing that's important is that he ushered in, or he brought in, he was a key person to starting to treat the mentally unhealthy people in a more humane way. So he was, though, an occultist. He was a physician. He was an occultist, and he was a demonologist. So he looked into, and he spent a lot of time studying these cases, and he found in most cases that people were not really witches, that people were not really demon possessed. So even though he was a proponent of it or studied it, interested in it, his conclusion was, these people are not possessed. These people are not being made to do things by the devil. These people just have an illness that they need to be treated for. So he ushered in, and he was the father of psychopathology. And he's the one who brought in that we need to care for them again, and we need to be civil in how we care for them, and actually showed that with loving care and respect, people could recover. And so people did start improving. And during that time, you'll see that some of the shrines were devoted to being turned into humane caring places for people, and people did start to improve, and the intention was good, but guess what happened? The same thing that seems to happen all the time is that overcrowding starts to happen. So you're short-staffed. If you're overcrowded, you don't have the staff for the people that are there. You don't have the space for the people that are there. And then they become like prisons. Then everything changes, people's attitudes change, and they're no longer this peaceful place for recovery. So we'll come up to the 19th century. Now, this is where, okay, things start to improve again. So Pinnell and Tukey came, and for both of them, what they really started to do was to introduce careful study of the patients. So now it's not just assuming that they're crazy and something's wrong with them, but let's study them. Let's start to do research, actually. Let's figure out what's going on. And so they became advocates for treating people in more humane types of ways. Now, that's not the only thing that brought it in. Benjamin Rush, who is the father of American psychiatry, so that's a good name to remember, and Dorothy Dix, who was a school teacher. So Benjamin Rush came in, and he was not only a psychiatrist, but he was also one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. I think that's pretty cool. But he believed that there was some type of bodily energy that needed to be balanced. So kind of like Hippocrates, when we go back to the humors and the balance of the fluids. So just like Hippocrates, he was also in favor of bloodletting. So releasing or taking out some of the blood and spinning. You can actually see some examples of the early treatments of psychotherapy that were used for people that were believed to be mentally deranged or ill. And Dorothy Dix, her contribution was that she visited the homes or the asylums, and she saw the terrible, inhumane care, and she reported it to the Congress. So she sent a report actually to the Congress on what she'd seen at the asylum, which in turn caused public policy and the country in general to start to look at it and say, okay, this is not okay, so we have to start changing things. So there was a reversal, and people were treated better. However, guess what happened again? Well, by the end of the 19th century, there was again another change because of, number one, staff shortages and overcrowding. Once again, they had too many people being admitted, too many people being diagnosed, and not enough staff, not enough money. That's why usually why you don't have enough staff. When you go in a store and there's only one register open and there's a big long line and they really need 3, but they've understaffed, and it's because of money. And then also, as a result of that, as care quality dropping, well, there was declining recovery rates, so that also added to people starting to have a negative attitude towards the mentally ill. And another thing that started to happen in the 19th century was a prejudice. So remember, we're talking about asylums in the U.S. It's really easy to grab or to develop a prejudice in the United States. And what happened was a lot of the people that were admitted into these asylums were foreigners. So people started to, it was easy for them to start to get negative feelings towards these people and have a prejudice towards the mentally ill, which means you're not going to give them the best treatment that you can. So let's go to the 20th century. And here's really a cool perspective, and it goes all the way back to Hippocrates because it's a somatogenic perspective. And I put in parentheses, your book doesn't say this, but it's also the organic causes perspective. So there was basically two movements or two perspectives that came in the 20th century, and one of them was this one, where it's physical causes. The other was the psychogenic perspective. So you got the somatogenic, which somatosensory, think about sensory and sensation and perception. So organic causes, physical causes. Then you've got the psychogenic perspective, which was basically psychological causes. So at the time, there was some crazy ideas out there. There was things like, I mean, this is where the word lunatic comes from, because they believed that the phases of the moon changed us organically or chemically and physically, and those were the causes of the abnormal behavior. So that's where the word lunatic comes from, lunar phases of the moon, right? Okay, so these, and this is important too, because we do know that some disorders come from actual physical causes. All the studies that we're going to go over where there's abnormalities in the brain, where there's neurochemical problems, and we know that a lot of the drugs, why they work, because they increase or decrease or enhance or block the action of neurotransmitters, which in turn relieve the patient of symptoms. So another thing that really added to this, though, was you'll see where it says new biological discoveries link such things as untreated syphilis and general paresis. General paresis was a condition that right away you should think of paralysis because of the word paresis. And you do find things like paralysis in this. But also there was delusions of grandeur, which is where you feel like you're the Messiah, or people think they're Jesus. And then there's dementia. So all those things were linked into general paresis. And here's what solved it or made them realize, look, there's some kind of biological connection here. And there's a physical factor involved in these mental dysfunctions, because Alfred Forner in 1884 discovered that out of all his patients, that had general paresis, when he looked back through their history, he found that they had syphilis. Then we go on to the psychogenic perspective. So what ushered this in? Why did people change? Well, first of all, when you look at it, the somatogenic perspective yielded some good results. Some medications were effective, yet a lot of things still weren't cured. There was still a lot of question, and it wasn't the answer. So it started to lose for everyone. What brought in psychogenic perspective? What really ushered it in? What caused the rise in the popularity of it was hypnotism. So now they're saying psychological functioning or abnormal functioning has a psychological cause. So Mesmer, which was actually Franz Frederick Anton Mesmer. Your book calls him Frederick. Well, his first name was actually Franz. Franz Frederick Anton Mesmer. He used hypnotism to treat hysterical disorders. Now, the thing with hysteria was the Greek word which means uterus. And mostly women were diagnosed with hysteria. So, and the word means uterus. Mesmerizing. That's where we get that word mesmerizing. So think of like when you've said, oh, he's mesmerized by her looks, or she's mesmerized by his charms. It's literally comes from the man's last name. So Freud comes along, and actually before Freud, let me back up a little bit. Charcot was a neurologist. He studied hysteria, and he developed actually the type of hypnosis that we know of today, where someone watches something or counts backwards and they're hypnotized and they're brought back in time. before Freud, also there was Breuer, Breuer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he came along and he used hypnosis to treat hysteria as well. And he took people back into their past and found out that talking about their past actually helped with their problem, with their mental illness. So think about this. If you think back to Principles of Psychology or Intro, whichever you took, Freud believed and taught us two things that actually turn out to be true. One, sometimes there's an unconscious motivation for something, and two, what happened to us in childhood affects us later in life. So maybe he kind of got a little bit of that idea from Breuer. So Freud latched on to the hypnosis and started what is called psychoanalysis. And he is essentially the one who came along and created outpatient therapy. So instead of staying in asylum, now you're visiting your therapist and you're going back home to your life. So he started what's now known as outpatient therapy. That's what we call it. So Freud focused in on dream analysis and hypnosis, and he used these things when treating his patients. So let's talk about recent decades and current trends. Well, negative public attitudes still exist. That's something you should definitely know might possibly be on the test. So have we gotten any better? After all these years and all this insight and all this research and everything we've learned, do we understand psychological problems and abnormal behavior any better? And it turns out that we don't. We still have so many misconceptions. There's so many things that are just false. And a couple of the statistics, 43% of people interviewed believe that people bring mental health disorders on themselves. I just want to read some statistics to you so I don't get them wrong. 31% of people view disorders as being the result of a personal weakness. So there's like an accusatory trend here. People today are looking at people with disorders as it's your fault, you brought it on yourself, it's some kind of weakness in you. Another 35% consider mental health disorders to be caused by sinful behavior. Now, the thing about this not only shows an ignorance in people with their knowledge of mental illness, but it also shows an ignorance for the Bible. They're trying to define sin and say that sin causes the mental behavior, but the whole Bible, completely, the message throughout the entire Bible goes against that. You can check me. Romans 3:23. You want to look that up. It says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." All have sinned. There's not just people with mental health disorders. So if that were true, if sin caused mental health disorders, then the entire population would have a mental health disorder because all have sinned. It also says in the Bible, Romans 3:9 and 10, both Jews and Greeks are under sin. None is righteous, no, not one. So going with the current trends and the current thinking, people are just off the mark completely. Mental illness is not the person's fault. They did not bring it on themselves in most cases. Now, if someone's doing drugs for many, many years, and then even when they get off the drugs, they've killed so many brain cells they can no longer function properly, okay, that's where you could argue with me that person brought it on themselves. But for the most part, people do not bring these disorders on themselves. It's not a result of some personal weakness. They just weren't strong enough to resist urges. And it's certainly not because they've sinned somewhere, because we've all sinned. So we would all be under that same theory or hypothesis. Okay, so how do we treat people with severe disturbances? Well, like schizophrenia, and we will talk more about that all through the semester, but we've come up with psychotropic medications, and they work. They work great. They don't solve everything, and if you take the drug away, the symptoms come right back, like with schizophrenia. So it's not a cure. It doesn't end it, but it makes it to where people can live with it. So, for example, antipsychotic drugs, what do they change? They change confused or distorted thinking. Antidepressant drugs, what do you think there? Depression. Anti-anxiety drugs, anxiety and tension. So they relieve these type of things so that you can live. That way you don't need to institutionalized people, they can live and function in their life. Even schizophrenics can live a much better life when they take their medication. A lot of problems with schizophrenics is they start to feel so normal and so okay that they feel like they really don't need the medication any longer, and they go off of it, and before you know it, the stuff, the hallucinations and the voices and everything else starts to slowly come back. The paranoias, the weird thoughts that someone is after them or watching them, or the government is out to get them, or that they have strange powers. All of those things start to come back. So because of the drugs, though, because we can relieve these symptoms, now it leads to deinstitutionalization. We don't have to have as many people in. And that's the modern trend, is that people are now more into outpatient care. But unlike Freud, it's different. It's not for years and years and years of going to see your therapist. It's now short term. You have short term outpatient care in combination with medication. And these things seem to work best. And that's what we're doing today. So we know that prevention programs, positive psychology, and we'll talk a little more about positive psychology later. We'll talk about how it focuses differently instead of on what's wrong, and it focuses more on the good things and the things that are right. And how do we, and that's why it's under prevention, how do we promote positive, healthy thinking, healthy cognition? How do we promote that? So it's more of like a prevention. Okay, so one thing I wanted to emphasize here, and I think this will help you remember it today, we use institutions a lot less. Not saying they don't still exist. However, there is a whole bunch of abandoned asylums, and there are like 5 right here in Virginia. So I find this very interesting, and I love urban explorers. These are people who go out all over the world, and they find abandoned homes, companies, stores, hospitals, whatever type, amusement parks. They find places that have just been left abandoned, standing still in time. And it's so interesting to me to look at it. So we're not going to watch the whole thing, but I did want to show you a couple that are in Virginia. I don't know where this is. A lot of times they won't give you the location because they don't want people to go and trash it. Unfortunately, we have there's people that just want to destroy and, tag, spray paint everything, and it kind of ruins it. Preserve it, leave it, don't touch it. Let everybody walk in and see. Now this place, and the reason I like this place is because it's untouched. And let me just say as a side note, you're going to hear this guy breathing really creepily. That's because he's a professional urban explorer, and he's wearing a mask. And he's wearing the type of mask that filters out asbestos and mold and things like that. And that's the problem with these abandoned buildings. There's a lot of dangerous things. The ceiling could cave in. You could fall through a floor. There could be vagrants in there. There could be criminals in there. There could be snakes there, and there could be molds and asbestos. So I'm not encouraging you to look, but certainly look at the ones who have already done it on videos, because it's very interesting. So this is an insane asylum in Virginia that was shut down. It's a very big building, and he goes through very nicely each room. I like these kind of explorers that show you everything and let you see it as they go through, kind of like you're exploring the place yourself. So you can see that a lot of the walls are peeling and things. And I'm going to let you watch this yourself, but what I want you to see is that when we get into the heart of it, so let's get further along, it looks like the whole place was kind of tiled, like they were living in a giant bathroom. That's what it's weird, because at first I thought, oh, this must be like the shower area, community shower area. But you can see by the furniture, it's a place where they hung out. It's a place where they sat. There's even some paintings on some of the tiles. So their everyday rooms were in these like shower rooms where there's tile everywhere. Now this obviously is a bathroom area. So interesting. So I'm going to skip along. Like I said, you can always go back and look at these things later. But I'm just hoping to show you the paintings. Oh, this is really weird to me. It looks like a dentist chair. However, that little mechanism up there is not a dentist tool. And it's not a dentist chair. So, and I don't know why they would have had, I mean, possibly they worked on their teeth there, but things just don't coincide. So I don't know what that chair was for. We know that for the longest time, in the next one I'm going to show you, they did perform lobotomies and straight jacket care. Everything was very stringent and really just inhumane. Let's move along here. And all along, you know, a lot of these people that might be hysterical or need to be in a straitjacket really just needed a balancing of their neurochemistry, and a pill would have taken care of that instead of, you know, subduing them and locking them up. So it's just very interesting to look at. Definitely go back and explore the place with him. Now, there was a bunch of these skinny little rooms. I don't know if they, you know, use them as solitary confinement for people in them. This obviously looks like a different type of room. That's the kind of stuff I don't like, that they don't pick it up and look at what's down there. I like to look at the literature when I'm exploring an abandoned place, because it kind of tells you something about the time period that it was left in. This place was from the 70s, I believe, so it's not, you know, super old, but that's pretty old. That's kind of weird, huh? The smile room. Okay, so anyway, you can look at these.
An epic new documentary.
Let's go to the other one. This one, this building just looks so incredible. And there's a particular doctor in here that was really strongly believed in sterilizing people who are crazy and making it to where they could not procreate. So he's very controversial, kind of very hated. And this was the asylum he worked in. And because of his craziness, he actually had to separate from the
about 6 years
hospital
ago from Texas.
and find a new location. So anyway, here's the
What is up, guys? It is Joe.
Look at it. How cool would that be to go in there? So it's a great architecture, it's beautiful buildings. Kind of a waste. We need to do something with it. And I think it's reported that, I think in 2008, they made, no, it can't be 2008. I just sworn I saw something where they said that they made condos out of it, high-priced condos.
Yes, state of decay.
Yep.
It's crazy.
So this building is a little better inside than the other one.
Let's go in here and see what this room
unfortunately, a lot of people have found it. And so you get the graffiti and you get the destruction everywhere, which is very sad to me. You know, that people destroy stuff like this.
Never
Just
been in a
leave it.
lunatic hospital
Let us
before.
all,
Remnants of a pool.
you know, go through and look at it. Yeah, there's a remnants of a pool table there.
We're just here to explore. So please let me know what you think. This is...
That's the name of the doctor, Joseph Desjardins. He's the one who was...
That's dangerous. I'm getting out of here.
Sterilizing people. He used to take blood from children and put it into crazy people, hoping it would cure them. He just had some bizarre ideas and got away with it for many years. Did it for many years. So you can see how just a series of very small rooms. Apparently, this is the size room the patients were kept in. At least they had a window.
It's intriguing.
There's one simple kissing technique any woman can use to make a man beg to be her boyfriend. It's really very...
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, how does that look? How cool is that?
I won't step out here too far and get seen. I had to steel cage. I want to keep people from jumping off or trying to escape. That's an eerie sound right there. Very creepy building, though.
Alright, a super creepy staircase right here.
Okay, so later they find like a devil worship star on the floor. So apparently somebody had gone in there and used it for whatever. So it's interesting, and you might want to look at it and just see the way people had to live. And so they're not a good thing, and it's good that they're gone. And And that's the current state of things. Now we do the outpatient treatment and treat people in more of a humane way. So what's a result of all this? Well, the thing is that now we have multicultural psychology, which is kind of a joke to me because we've always considered, at least for the past, I don't know, since I've been a student, I don't want to tell you how long that's been, but we've always considered culture and its effect. And yes, we're considering it more because the makeup in the United States has changed. You know, we have a lot more diversity in our country than we used to have before. So maybe that's why they've started a whole genre they're calling multicultural psychology. But all fields of psychology have always considered culture, even the bio-bases perspective, because think about it, there's like whole races that are more susceptible to getting hepatitis B or hepatitis C, whereas Westerners and Americans really are not susceptible to that disease as much as somebody from Africa. So there are differences according to different cultures. So I looked up the U.S. Census, all right, and I'm looking right now at what our makeup is here in the United States. So I want to see how diverse we really are. And it turns out that white non-Hispanics, which has always been the majority in our country, I'll give you an example, in 1950, they made up 87.5% of the population. So that's almost 90% of the population was white non-Latino. Now, today, with 2017 census, white non-Hispanics has dropped to 60.7%. That's a huge drop in just less than 100 years, less than 1 century. It's dropped over 20, almost 30 points, 30%. That's a lot. Blacks make up 13.4%. Hispanics have taken second place. They make up 18.1% of the population in the United States. And Asians are 5.8%, and the rest are under 5%. So every other culture we have here, not even 5%. In fact, American Indians, who were the original people to be here, are only 1.8% of the population of the United States today. So we know that we're diverse. We are diverse. However, it's 3 main races, really. It's the non-Hispanic white, it's Hispanic, and it's Black African American. So psychologists in this field or in this perspective now are considering more the cultural differences, I guess. But I don't see how that's ever been different. Really, in my opinion, in all my textbooks, as a student, we have always looked at culture and its effect, and all the years that I've read, researched, and studied, that's what I've seen. So I guess it's a new way for someone to make a name for themselves. That's the way I see it. Okay, so now let's look at insurance. How is insurance influencing coverage? And you're going to read a lot about this in your book, so I'm not going to go over a lot of detail, but really, insurance, think about it. If your insurance company does not approve something, or even when your doctor says you need something, your insurance company can step in and say, we're not going to cover that. We don't believe they need it. We don't believe they need to stay an extra day. It's because of the insurance companies that women who have babies have to leave that day. There's no staying a couple days. You're not feeling well. It was a harsh pregnancy. It was a harsh delivery. No. You get in, you get out. They don't want to pay for the extra nights for you to be at the hospital. So it's difficult to get proper care because insurance companies are trying to take the place of doctors, and they're trying to say what it is you need and what you don't need. Well, the same thing happens with abnormal psychology. In fact, it's even worse, because with abnormal psychology, well, that's a mental disorder. That's not like, okay, you can go and get a shot and we'll cover the shot and we'll cover one doctor's visit. They don't want to cover you going back and back and back. And sometimes a lot of insurance companies don't cover psychological care. So an important an important change that went into effect in 2014 was with the Affordable Care Act. And it says that mental disorders have to be treated, that insurance companies have to cover them. So that's something that is a big change. It's a positive change. And I know that the changes that are being proposed to our healthcare today still include that. So that's a good thing. So these are just the topics, or the leading topics, that we went over, and we're going to continue to go over them more in chapter 3. So the perspectives, the psychoanalytic, again, was Freud. We talked about Freud, the psychodynamic theory, treating people by outpatient care, the biological, which has its roots all the way back to Hippocrates and the humors, and then somatogenic perspective, then the cognitive behavioral. At one time, those were two separate perspectives. You had the cognitive perspective, and you had the behavioral perspective. You might remember that we tackled those separately in principles and intro, but really now today they work together, the cognitive and behavioral. It's like, let's change the behavior, the unwanted behavior, and let's change the thought process and the thinking, and that is one of my absolute favorite. The humanistic existential is, again, like Carl Rogers, if you remember back to Principles, where he would have therapy and really just affirm what the patient was saying without judgment, and let them just talk it out without any kind of judgment or feeling of judgment, and really no advice. And so the humanistic perspective, as you're going to see, doesn't do a lot for abnormal psychology. It doesn't have the kind of results of recovery that you would hope for or look for. The sociocultural speaks for itself. That's considering culture and social interaction between people. And then developmental psychopathology, again, is kind of an overlap. It's something that we consider in each of the perspectives. Psychoanalytic certainly considers childhood and adulthood, and biological considers the development biologically throughout our lives and the changes and the things that affect us. Well, that's what developmental psychopathology does. It looks at the development over time through your life. These are just professions. You can look over these yourself. More female psychologists go into social work and counseling. Psychiatry is obviously the top of the field. It's the best way to make money, but you also have to get a medical degree along with it. So you're going to get a psychology degree and a medical degree. That is getting 2 doctorates. That's very, very hard to do. It's a hard road. It's a long road. Just like becoming a surgeon or anything else, it's extremely difficult and time-consuming, and it becomes your life. It's going to become your life to reach that goal. But if you feel that way and you've got a good spouse that can help you with your family and put up with it, you could go that route. So don't let that discourage you. And the payoff, obviously, in the end is very big. So now, just looking quickly at technology and mental health, I don't want to down all of technology because I love it. I can't leave the house without my phone. Same thing. Have you ever had that? It's kind of like social withdrawal. So, have you ever left your house and realized that your phone was not on you? Did you literally risk being late and turning around and getting it, no matter what the cost? Because you couldn't stand the thought of the day without it immediately, as soon as you knew it wasn't with you. It's amazing how addicted that we can get to having that connection, having that constant connection, and it does become a mental state. There's also good things too. So I want to point out also that now we can use technology to give mental health services, which makes it more affordable and opens up a world of therapy to people that may not have been able to access it before. And now there's apps that you can get in the marketplace, and there's so much web-based information. It's kind of scary because I'm afraid that people are going to start trying to self-diagnose themselves when they haven't had 8 years of college training behind them and more. So don't self-diagnose, please. But know that there is more access to it out there in the field. So that's it for chapter 1. I hope that you did all the exercises. They're really important. that will help you. The self-quizzing for sure. And if you want to make flashcards for the chapters, that would be a really good idea, and have people quiz you. Okay, so I will see you next video.